the force of
absolute power,
aristocracy in the Senate. The Senate was supposed to be aristocratic, and it was for a while before like the 15th, whatever gas amendment, the direct election of senators, and then the presidency was the focus of monarchy.
Right.
And the Supreme Court was originally supposed to just be like a judicial organ. But again, that's another structure of oligarchy, and that's a very, very low frequency oligarchy, which has very slow turnover, right? And then the like power dynamic between all of these institutions is left entirely unspecified. This is how basically, in a way, it's sort of Hamiltonian government is like killed with Marbury versus Madison, which you probably read about in public school, where the Supreme Court is like, no, actually, I read the Constitution and it doesn't say this, but they meant we're in charge, right? You know, and so what's neat about this system and what has made it like survive a lot of crises that really probably should have killed it is that basically about every 75 or 80 years, you have a regime change in the United States. You have a replacement of like the whole actual structural forces of government under the same name, which is a very common thing in history. And it leads to like
go into this more.
And it leads to like a different structure of forces. So and it centers around a president who is actually a monarch. Not in that they call themselves king. As you know, the Roman emperors never called. Valerian didn't call himself
FDR
king.
is an example of this.
FDR is an example, and who else? Lincoln. There you go. So basically, what you have in all three cases is you have basically this startup regime. And this startup regime, in Lincoln's case, one of the interesting things about Lincoln from a Silicon Valley, I'm just going to start saying Silicon Valley.
Like, it sounds better.
It sounds better, right? You know, and it has all these like salacious overtones.
Yes.
You know, and you know, one of these Silicon Valley things is that you look at the Lincoln administration. And you notice that the Lincoln administration is run by this like weirdo, self-educated, wild, genius political talent, Abraham Lincoln, really the first great American politician. And some might say Jackson, some might say Van Buren. Like Lincoln is like a combination of Jackson and Van Buren,
right?
You know, and he's like a Machiavellian genius, and he's also like a genius orator. And he really convinces people to this day, like think that Lincoln had like some kind of like philosophy. Lincoln's philosophy was whatever's good for Abraham Lincoln, and you know, and he was a master politician. And basically, FDR's philosophy is also whatever is good for FDR. I want to think Washington and Hamilton are like pure. Right. But the thing is, even with this level of like, you know, I don't really approve of Lincoln and FDR. I don't approve of a lot of things that went on in their regimes. However, one notices a couple of things about them. One is that basically, if you look, for example, at the Lincoln administration, you'll see that a lot of it, the government that Lincoln controls, mainly focusing on the war effort, is controlled by these young 20-something guys. Nicolay and Hay. Hay later becomes the Secretary of State in like the McKinley administration. And you're just like, aha, I see an organization run absolutely from the top down by a pair of guys in their 20s.
Right.
Where have I fucking seen this before?
Right.
You know?
Facebook. Yeah.
And where have I fucking seen this before?
Yeah.
And they win, right? You know, and they win because they're awesome. And then you basically see that these regimes are created as these monarchical structures. Then kind of central power kind of decays and they become oligarchies. And it's like once there were like wires going up to the wheelhouse and the wires are cut.
Why does central power decay?
It's central power decays because everything, you know, it's like that's asking why do people die? People all die for a different reason. They die in different ways. Let's get forward to the FDR regime. So the FDR regime is this quintessence of this like university-driven revolution. Because who are the universities for 100 years ago? For the fucking upper class. They're for the like the 500 families, like the people that actually matter in this country. Like this is a revolution of the university class. FDR himself, personally, like Lincoln, I guess, is not really a manager. FDR is actually in some ways a lot like Trump. He's a very vain person. He's quite intelligent. He's like not really into books. He's like totally dominates a room when he comes into it. He's like the most charming person in the world, very shallow. But there's a huge difference between FDR and Trump, which is that FDR is from a super, like one of the most aristocratic American families.
Roosevelt's.
The Roosevelts, he has huge confidence and he knows how to delegate. Because every time Trump tries to delegate, he's like, can I trust this person?
Right.
What if he's trying to become bigger than me? You know, what if Steve Bannon is trying to exceed me? And like, he's like the worst fucking, you know, anyway, I don't want to say, I hate saying bad things about people, even if they're Donald Trump.
Right.
You know, I think Donald Trump would make an excellent chairman of the board. And that is the right job for him. He should be promoted. It's a promotion. It's a more important job being chairman of the board than being CEO. And so, Donald, if you're listening, you know, stay off of Urbit. But also,
he's going on Urbit. He's on his way to Urbit.
Stay
right
off of
now.
Urbit and start thinking of yourself as like the CEO emeritus.
And you've made this point.
So anyway, so getting back to FDR, and like this is sort of the birth of what we call the deep state.
Right.
Originally a Turkish word, I think first popularized by my friend Steve Saylor. And
Peter Dale Scott had deep politics. Maybe.
Yeah. It's close. It's the same basic thing.
Yeah.
Right. You know, Scott was very familiar with like the sort of, you know, foreign, you know, like the aid industrial complex, you know, which my father worked for, you know, and the whole foreign policy insanity.
Apparatus,
right? Yeah, the whole apparatus. You know, that's just one arm of this deep state that was created by trusting the experts, right? You know, nobody even knows what it's fucking for anymore. Right. Nobody even knows what it's fucking for. And people just like make up reasons like we got to predict all the viruses, right? You know, that is the level of like top level geostrategic thinking. And U.S. foreign policy is at the level of let's collect all the viruses, right? You know, but going back to sort of the you know the birth of this system, like there's a couple of things that I say to describe like the New Deal and the New Deal era. One is I was particularly struck by a book in Theodore White's Making the President in 1960, a very famous political book, in which he's talking to one of the Kennedy people or one of the older people who's kind of involved in like the new frontier. And when we think about the new frontier, we think about the Kennedy world. And there's this kind of edge of monarchy to like Kennedy world because this is a big family. And you know, Roosevelt had kids as well, but they were just like incredibly corrupt, incompetent fucks. And there was no way to take them seriously as politicians, you know, unlike say Teddy Kennedy. Maybe it was a more serious time as well. But the thing is, you see all of these monarchical complexes developing. Right. And so you see that when you have someone like FDR, who I encourage like all of my fans, but especially the libs to think of when they think of monarchy, when you see someone like FDR, basically like, you know, and you see that, okay, he's not technically a hereditary monarch, but like the sort of attributes of hereditary monarchy that are like hereditary succession start forming as they have formed for thousands of years throughout human history. So like, you know, you start to, from this perspective, you start to lose your kind of temporal exceptionalism. You're like, history isn't ending at all. And like government is kind of the same thing it's always been. Right. And, you know, if government is the same thing it's always been, it's easy to look at FDR's world and see a couple of different things. One is, remember I was talking, there was a guy like T.H. White, T.E. White, something, I forget his name, author of Making the President in 1960, is talking to someone who remembers the New Deal era, and he's basically in the New Frontier Act. And when we think of like the New Frontier in Camelot, this is like the most exciting time ever. This is like, my God, like being a frontiersman, like, you know, like, you know, Kennedy has Robert Frost read it as inauguration. Biden has Amanda Gorman read one of these things, maybe not quite like the other, you know, like, and so you have this like, you know, excellence, at the top, and the sense of like heredity sort of forming, and you're just like, what does this like Kennedy cult of the Kennedys have to do with like the American Revolution, right? You know, and so you're seeing all of these things develop. Those things are way more intense in the Roosevelt era. This guy who remembers the New Deal is like, oh yeah, you know, everything seems kind of dull and drab in the new frontier. To anyone who remembers the New Deal. That's how much fucking startup energy the New Deal had. It's like working at Google in 2003. Basically, you know, here is, you know, let's say you graduate from Harvard in like 1936 versus 2016. If you graduate from Harvard in 1936 with a degree in this new field of economics, a field that has basically been completely reinvented in the last 20 years, you're like, oh, you know, I'm a Harvard man, I'm really smart, and I know somebody who knows Tommy Corcoran, or Felix Frankfurter, or someone like that, and somebody calls somebody, and I get a phone call, and they're like, would you like to come to DC? Yeah. Concealing your excitement. You're like, sure, okay, I'm not doing anything else this time of year. And you come to but what would I be doing? And the voice on the phone is like, we don't know, and it doesn't matter. Come to DC. Right. And you come to DC and somebody puts you in an office and is like, okay, your job is to go, here's $5 million. Your job is to go electrify Arkansas. Like, that's the New Deal experience. That's a fucking startup experience. And you're like 21. Right. And you're like, okay. And you get it fucking done in like 9 months.
Yeah.
Right. And like that is what created the enormous faith in like the powers of the US government that people had at that time. The New Deal actually got shit done. And, ever driven on Route 1? That's a New Deal project.
Of course.
Imagine that happening now.
No.
Imagine, right? It is the laugh, right? And so it's this amazingly effective thing. It's full of the best people in society. And it's like incredibly dynamic. It gives you incredible levels of like personal responsibility at incredibly young ages. Now, imagine you graduate from Harvard in 2016 with a degree in economics. You're like, okay, I'm going to apply for an unpaid internship on the Hill. Do they pay their interns? I don't know. They make their own dick, right? In any case, you really should have family that can help you out because you got to spend $1,300 on a room the size of a shoebox, and then you're on somebody's staff and you're answering letters from Pork Pie, Iowa, and then do they ever write? Then even when you after 20 years, you're not even writing legislation. Certainly, the senators, like the congressmen, never write any legislation. They barely look at it. They pass these bills they haven't even read. The staff doesn't even write the legislation. They edit the legislation. They get lines from like lobbyists and activists, which are the kind of two real sides of Congress.
Right.
And you're just like, this is like this insane thing. And like, as a young person, there's just no like joy in it. So as a young person, your mind naturally turns after 75 or 80 years. And by the way, let me finish explaining what happens at the top. So FDR is not a brilliant manager. He's a brilliant collector of talents. He's like more like Peter Thiel than Elon Musk.
Right.
And so he basically collects these entire talents at the head of this organization, and does all these like completely unethical things about World War II. I always recommend Nicholson Baker's book, Human Smoke. It's sort of one of the few, it sort of gives you the right mood of World War II, which is not a Marvel movie. That's, as much as I want to, it is not a Marvel movie, right? And so FDR in 44 realizes that he's dying. Anyone who's in the know knows he's dying. Remember, the fucking people out there are so brainwashed by the cathedral of that time, they don't even know he's paralyzed.
Interesting.
They don't even know he's
That's right.
They
That's
don't even know he's
fucking
paralyzed. They don't know he's had like a private subway station in New York built for like, it's like this is a level at which like if you look at the distance at the level how easy it is to like contain the truth from the perspective of the media at that time, it's just like this.
Amazing.
Right? It's amazing, right? It's Orwellian. Like Orwell worked for the BBC, right? He knew this, right? And so Roosevelt in 44, he's dying. He knows he's dying. Everybody who's in the know knows he's dying. The public is informed that he's in the best of health, fit as a fiddle.
Right.
And anyone who looks at him can see he's dying. And so his previous, vice president has been Henry Wallace. Now, one thing to understand about the 30s, which was sometimes called the Red Decade, is that in the 30s, everyone who was cool
was
a communist.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Just read a book by Eugene Lyons called The Red Decade, and you'll see that clearly. A communist or a communist sympathizer. My grandparents were actually communists. Right. This is a non-debatable historical fact.
Right.
So, but basically, the communists are at this time, they're selling like 1 or 2% of the population. If you look at the people who voted for the same guy, Henry Wallace, in 48, when he ran on the Progressive Party ticket, note that word progressive.
Yeah.
That's also what my grandparents called themselves. In fact, they were card-carrying communists.
Right.
You've heard that word somewhere else, progressive, right?
Yes.
And its meaning has never changed. It's just like most people who call themselves progressives don't even know the history of the word.
Right.
They're like those people in like New Mexico who still practice like the Jewish rituals, but don't even know they're Jews, but that's where, even cancellation, that's a communist practice that comes from an internal, internal, if you read a book called The Romance of American Communism, there are all these like cancellation memoirs from like the 50s, right? From inside the party.
Yes.
And so anyway, but FDR realizes that he intends to found a regime. He intends to found something that is his that will last for many years, certainly into the 2020s after him. And therefore, America must no longer be a monarchy. What must happen is that basically all of these bright, amazing people, like the best and the brightest, right? You know, in the 60s, it's still kind of the best and the brightest. You can use that without like joking. Like nobody would describe like Susan Rice as the best and the brightest, right? You know, and she's not dumb, right? You know, actually her son is like a famous based Stanford person. Yeah. Susan Rice is not dumb. This is public. And Susan Rice is not dumb.
For sure she's not dumb.
She's not dumb. But she's not fucking Dean Acheson.
Correct.
John Bolton is also not Dean Acheson. You know, I read fucking John Bolton's book, and he's like, basically, he's like, I am the second coming of Dean Acheson.
Yeah, he's
like,
not.
We have the same mustache.
He's not.
Yeah, okay.
But Dean Acheson avoided wars.
Yeah, well, you know,
slightly.
I can say some things about Dean Acheson.
Sure.
But, you know,
but I mean, John Bolton loves a
Yeah. In any case, basically, like, these are pygmies, right? You know, and so, you know, what you see is basically FDR does this pharaonic thing, where as his successor and vice president in 1944, he picks Harry Truman. And who the fuck is Harry Truman? Harry Truman is a nobody. So what? And like, he's a nobody of like very limited intelligence, very limited. He's not really prominent. He's a member of like the Pendergast boss faction. He's not even a progressive Democrat. He's not even a New Dealer.
Right.
And so basically, by picking someone who's not even a New Dealer, which is a master stroke, it was FDR's finest stroke, because he's basically saying, who is going to succeed me? The answer is a nobody.
Right.
And it's immediately reminiscent of Alexander the Great when he was dying. I don't know if this story is true. It's a story I've read. It's a cool story. He's dying, and all of his like henchmen, he's like 30 or something, all of his henchmen are gathered around him. And they're like, who shall inherit the empire of Alexander? Who shall be the next, you know, who shall the kingdom go to? Who shall the empire go to? And his last two words are tokratos, which means to the strongest. And so, you know, almost these people almost like figuratively like pull out their fucking swords in like the funeral room. Right. You know, and so, but FDR is doing something slightly different by saying power should go to nobody. He ensures that Harry Truman does not have the gravitas or power to actually command the deep state.
That's right.
And so he basically lets the deep state command him and give him little teleprompter scripts to read. He's not like demented and he doesn't start reading the directions on the teleprompter, but he basically is like inaugurates the era of the kind of semi-figurehead president. And power has you know, since he's,
and by the time you get to Eisenhower is openly saying, I don't really know what goes on.
I don't really know what goes on. And since then, Nixon does this thing. Does this thing where he's like, no, I will really be the president and try to regain command of the bureaucracy.
Yeah, good luck with that.
This is the way Bolton and Barr also think. Bolton and Barr also have this thing of like, let's actually try to, we're the grown-ups in the room. We will actually make the U.S. government work. No, you won't, you fucks. You know, and like go like shave your mustache and retire, right? You know, and so that basically sort of brings us to the like political structure of today. That's how we got to the oligarchy we're in today. If you pull back from that story of like where the deep state is the New Deal, it's the personal regime of FDR without the person of FDR.
The New Deal comes into play. All of the people, the architects of the New Deal, become the heads of all these institutions. All of these institutions are now more powerful than Harry Truman.
The great foundations.
The great foundations.
Carnegie, you know, like Carnegie, Rockefeller, Ford. There's a whole philanthropic industrial complex.
All of these young...
And they all have exactly the same fucking ideas. And these ideas are like dumber than a post and smell like shit.
Does this structure work at all? Does it work at all?
No, it has to be completely ripped out. And here is basically the problem, is that it has to be completely ripped out, and the only sort of form of government that can rip it out is the same form of government that the U.S. goes through every 75 or 80 years.
Which is a monarchy.
Which is basically, and so...
Is the worry, because a lot of people that read your work and say it's very interesting, but they go, the people that really also seem to like it are people that love or seem to flirt with the idea of theocracy.
So it's funny you should use the word theocracy,
right,
Tim?
Yes.
Because have you ever seen signs on people's lawns that tell you what to think?
Yeah, well, no, for sure. That's another kind of theocracy.
So in a way, it's like it's an interesting point because in a sense, like you conclude when looking at history that sort of the libertarian kind of freedom of speech world has never exactly been a thing.
Right.
And so your question of how to sort of do something like that is like basically what you have to realize is that most human beings will sort of always believe what they're taught to think.